It is the 2nd of November, 1698. 5 ships come out of the haze off the Caribbean coast of what will one day be called Panama. The Caledonia, the St. Andrew, the Unicorn, the Dolphin, the Endeavour. They have been at sea for almost 4 months. Below deck are 1,200 people, farmers, soldiers, ministers, widows, and 25,000 pairs of leather shoes. They have come to sell them: wigs, woolen cloth, combs, Bibles. In the tropics, these are not adventurers. This is a nation's savings, floating. The Company of Scotland holds close to 1/5 of every coin circulating in the kingdom, and almost all of it is on these 5 ships. Their instructions are precise. Proceed to the Bay of Darien. Make a settlement on the mainland. They name the bay Caledonia. They name the settlement New Edinburgh. They cut a fort out of the swamp and call it Fort St. Andrew. Then the rain begins. It does not stop for weeks. Fever moves through the huts faster than the ministers can bury anyone. The cassava will not take in the soil they have chosen. The Guna who live along this coast are willing enough to talk, but they have no use for woolen cloth and no interest in shoes. By the following July, the first colony is abandoned. A second fleet arrives 4 months later, 1,300 more people, most of whom do not yet know that the first attempt has already ended. They last until February. Of roughly 2,500 Scots who sailed for this coast, fewer than 300 saw Scotland again. The shares became paper. The lowland economy went with them, and a kingdom that had staked 1/4 of its liquid wealth on a strip of jungle no longer had the means to stand alone. 7 years later, Scotland signed the Act of Union. It was not the Spanish who beat them, though the Spanish came. It was not the English, though the English were ordered not to sell them so much as a barrel of flour. It was the ground. 3 centuries later, that ground has not changed its mind. It is why the longest road on Earth has a hole in it. This is Panama. There is a road that begins at Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic coast of Alaska and ends at Ushuaia at the bottom of Argentina. Something close to 30,000 kilometers of it. The Pan American Highway. It crosses tundra. It crosses the Sonoran Desert. It climbs through the Andes at altitudes where engines lose power. It is, by most measures, the longest motorable road in the world. And it stops in a town called Yaviza. Yaviza sits in the province of Darien, in the east of Panama, about 4,000 people, a market, a hospital, the crumbling stonework of a Spanish fort called San Jeronimo. The bus from Panama City takes most of a day. The road runs into the town, past the last of the houses, and simply ends. Cracked pavement, a low curb, and then the bank of the Chucunaque River. On the other side, there is forest. For the next 106 kilometers until the road picks up again at Turbo in Colombia, there is nothing. No highway, no bridge, no ferry. Nothing you could drive. 2 continents joined by land at their narrowest point, and you cannot drive from one to the other. Cars that make the journey do not make it. They are craned onto container ships in Colón and lifted off again in Cartagena. while their owners fly over the trees in 90 minutes. This is the Darien Gap, and the thing most people assume about it is wrong. It is not that nobody has managed to build the road, it is that 4 separate times people who could have built it decided not to. To understand why, you have to go back further than any road. Somewhere around 3 million years ago, 2 plates of the Earth's crust ground into one another in the eastern Pacific, and a chain of volcanic islands began to rise. Sediment filled the channels between them. Over time, the gaps closed. North America and South America had spent tens of millions of years apart. Now, they were welded together by a strip of land at its narrowest, only about 50 kilometers wide. The oceans on either side were cut off from each other. The Atlantic grew saltier. Currents rearranged themselves into what became the Gulf Stream, which is a large part of the reason northern Europe is warm enough to farm. And the animals started walking. They came south. Bears, cats, dogs, horses, deer, raccoons. They came north. Opossums, armadillos, porcupines, ground sloths the size of cars. Scientists call it the Great American Biotic Interchange. It is the largest overland migration event in the history of the Americas, and it happened here, on ground you can walk across in a morning. Remember that. This narrow country was built as a bridge. It was crossed by almost everything alive. The exception came later. 230 species of mammal live in Panama. More than 970 species of bird, which is more than the United States and Canada hold between them in a country roughly the size of South Carolina. Something in the order of 10% of the world's butterflies are here, around 16,000 species of moth. And above all of it, in the oldest forest in the east, there is a bird that most Panamanians will never see, the harpy eagle. It stands close to a meter tall. Its rear talons are around 13 centimeters long, which is longer than the claws of a grizzly bear, and its grip is strong enough to crush the bones of a sloth. It does not soar. Soaring is for open country. The harpy hunts inside the canopy, moving between trunks with a wingspan of 2 meters, taking monkeys and sloths from the branches at speed. For that, it needs a particular thing. Not a park, not a protected list. Unbroken forest, large enough that a single pair can hold a territory of many square kilometers and find enough sloths in it to feed one chick for 10 months. Panama made it the national bird in 2002. It is on the coat of arms. The largest population left in Central America is in Darien, in the block of lowland rainforest on the other side of that broken pavement at Yaviza. Researchers working there since 2000 have located and monitored 56 nest sites across the country. The bird cannot live in a forest with a road through it. Hold on to that as well. But the story of this isthmus does not begin in the trees. It begins with a man standing on a hill. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crosses the Darien with a party of Spaniards and several hundred indigenous porters. It takes them 25 days to travel a distance that would take you an afternoon on a modern road. On the 25th of September, he climbs a ridge alone and sees water on the far side. He wades into it in armor, holding a banner, and claims the entire ocean for Castile. 6 years later, a rival governor named Pedro Arias de Avila accused him of treason and had him beheaded in the town square at Acla. The ocean kept the name Balboa gave it, the Pacific, the peaceful one. Panama's currency is still called the Balboa. There is a port district named after him. What is not commemorated is what the crossing cost the people who carried the equipment, or the Cueva communities of the Darien, who within 2 generations of that walk had effectively ceased to exist as a people. The Spanish understood immediately what they had: not a country, a hinge. In 1519, Avila founded a city on the Pacific shore, Panama. It was the first permanent European settlement on the Pacific coast of the Americas, and within a decade, it was the staging ground for the conquest of the Inca. Everything Francisco Pizarro took out of Peru came back through here. Silver from Potosi, gold, emeralds, loaded onto ships at the Pacific docks, carried up the coast, unloaded, strapped to mules, and walked across the isthmus on a stone road the Spanish called the Camino Real, the Royal Road. 60 or 70 kilometers of paving stones through rainforest, climbing the Continental Divide and dropping to the Caribbean at Portobello, where the treasure fleets waited. For nearly 200 years, a substantial share of the wealth of the Spanish Empire crossed this narrow country on the backs of mules, which meant that everyone who wanted that wealth knew exactly where to stand. It is the 28th of January, 1671. Henry Morgan comes across the isthmus from the Caribbean side with around 1,400 men. They have already taken the fortress at the mouth of the Chagres River. They march for 9 days on short rations, chewing leather.
On the 28th,
they come out of the trees onto the savannah outside Panama. The city's defenders form up and are broken within hours, and then the city burns. To this day, nobody agrees on who lit it. Morgan blamed the Spanish governor, who is said to have ordered the powder magazines fired rather than let them fall. The Spanish blamed Morgan. What is certain is that a city of some 5,000 people burned for weeks and was never rebuilt on that spot. You can walk through what is left. Panama Viejo, on the eastern edge of the modern capital. Coral stone walls the color of ash. The tower of the cathedral, roofless, open to the sky, with the sea behind it and glass towers on the horizon. The survivors moved 8 kilometers southwest to a rocky peninsula that could be defended by a wall, and started again. That second city is Casco Viejo, and it is still standing. Which tells you something about how this country has always worked. It does not resist, it relocates. The Caribbean end of that mule road was a bay called Portobello. Columbus named it on his 4th voyage, the beautiful port. For most of the year it was almost empty. Then the fleet came, and for 6 weeks it became one of the largest markets on Earth. The Portobello fairs worked like this. Galleons arrived from Spain, loaded with cloth, iron, wine, paper, everything a colony could not make for itself. The mule trains came over the divide, loaded with silver. Merchants set up in the square, and the 2 cargoes traded places. Contemporary accounts describe silver bars stacked in the open street like firewood, because there was nowhere else to put them. Which is the problem with concentrating that much value in one small bay. Francis Drake attacked the coast here and died of dysentery offshore in 1596. His crew sealed him in a lead coffin and dropped him into the bay, where he remains. William Parker sacked the town in 1601. Edward Vernon took it in 1739 with 6 ships, which caused such celebration in London that a road in the city was renamed Portobello. The Spanish answered with stone. Fort San Jeronimo, Fort Santiago, the great customs house, batteries cut into the headlands on both sides of the entrance. It did not matter. Once the fares stopped, once Spain rerouted its trade around Cape Horn to avoid the isthmus entirely, the town had no reason to exist. The forest came back over the gun positions. Trees grow out of the walls now. Portobello today is a village of a few thousand people, mostly descended from the enslaved Africans brought here to load the mules and cut the stone, and from those who escaped into the hills and were never recovered. Their descendants kept something. It is called Congo, a tradition of dance, song, and improvised theater performed at Carnival, in which the participants speak a deliberately scrambled Spanish, mock the colonial authorities to their faces, and dress as figures from a court that no longer exists. It began as a way of saying things that could not otherwise be said out loud. And in the church at the center of the village, there is a wooden statue of Christ, dark-skinned, life-size, that arrived by sea in the 1600s under circumstances nobody can fully account for. Every October the 21st, tens of thousands of people walk to Portobello, some of them on their knees for the last kilometers, to carry it through the streets on a platform that takes 80 men to lift. The empire that built this town is gone. The fares are gone. The road is a footpath. The procession has not missed a year. The Spanish never did solve the isthmus. They carried their wealth across it by mule for 2 centuries because there was no other way, and every ounce of that effort came down to a single fact: 50 kilometers of land between 2 oceans. Somebody was always going to try to cut through it. It is January 1880, a conference hall in Paris. Ferdinand de Lesseps stands in front of an audience and announces that he will build a canal across Panama at sea level, with no locks, in 12 years. He is 74 years old. He has just finished the Suez Canal, which everyone said was impossible, and which is now the most profitable piece of infrastructure on the planet. The audience applauds. Suez was a ditch through a desert. Panama was a mountain range in a rainforest that receives more than 3 meters of rain a year, sitting on top of the Chagres, a river capable of rising 10 meters in a single day. And it had mosquitoes. Nobody yet knew that mosquitoes carried anything. Hospital beds in the French camps stood in dishes of water to keep the ants off. The dishes bred the larvae that killed the patients.
The French dug for 8 years.
They spent something in the region of $287 million, an enormous sum for the era, and they moved a great deal of earth, and the mud came back down into the cuttings faster than the steam shovels could lift it out. Around 22,000 people died, most of them from yellow fever and malaria, most of them laborers brought from the West Indies, whose names were not recorded with any care. In 1889, the company collapsed. The resulting scandal brought down ministers in Paris and put de Lesseps himself in court. He died a few years later, at home, unable to speak. The machines stayed where they were. Some of them are still in the trees. The Americans took over the concession in 1904, and they made one decision that changed everything, and it had nothing to do with engineering. They put a doctor in charge. William Crawford Gorgas had run the yellow fever campaign in Havana. He understood that the enemy was not the swamp in general, but one insect in particular, and he attacked it with a method that sounds absurd until you see the numbers. Every building in the canal zone was screened. Every water container was covered. Standing water was drained or filled or sprayed with a film of oil and kerosene so the larvae could not breathe. Houses were fumigated with sulfur and pyrethrum, block by block. The canal engineers thought he was wasting money that should have gone into digging. It took the president's backing to keep him funded. By the end of 1905, yellow fever had gone from the isthmus. It has never returned. The other decision was to stop fighting the Chagres River and use it. Instead of cutting a channel down to sea level, they dammed the river near its mouth and let it flood the valley behind. The result was Gatun Lake, 425 square kilometers of fresh water sitting 26 meters above the sea. Ships do not cross Panama. They are lifted over it. A vessel enters the locks at one end and a chamber fills by gravity alone, no pumps, and raises it in 3 steps to the height of the lake. It sails across the drowned valley, threads the Culebra Cut through the Continental Divide, and is lowered back down on the other side. The Culebra Cut was the hardest thing anyone had attempted. 14 kilometers of rock and unstable shale through the spine of the Americas, with 68 steam shovels working at once, and landslides that undid months of work in an afternoon. 5,609 deaths were recorded during the American decade. The real figure was almost certainly higher. As before, the overwhelming majority were contract laborers from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, working the drilling and blasting crews for a fraction of the wage paid to Americans, housed separately, buried separately. One of them, a man named Alfred Doughton, later described watching trainloads of the dead carted away daily as though they were so much lumber. The canal opened in August 1914. It cost around $375 million, and it came in ahead of schedule. It also drowned a valley. When the water rose behind the Gatun Dam, the hilltops did not go under. They became islands. The largest of them covers 15 square kilometers and is called Barro Colorado for the red clay of its soil. In 1923, it was set aside as a reserve, and the following March, a small laboratory opened there with $17,000 of private money. It has been running ever since. What makes Barro Colorado unusual is not the forest. There is a great deal of forest in Panama. It is that this particular patch has been watched continuously by scientists for more than 100 years. Every large tree on a 50-hectare plot has been measured, mapped, and identified since 1980, and remeasured every 5 years since. More than 13,000 scientific papers have come out of the island. We know things here that we do not know anywhere else on Earth. How often lightning strikes a tropical tree and which species survive it. How a forest changes over decades of shifting rainfall. What happens to a fragment of forest when the land around it is removed? The last question is the one that matters most, and the island only exists to answer it because of an accident. The canal builders were not thinking about ecology, they were thinking about water. The reserve is a byproduct of a shipping lane. Some of the most important work done there has been on ants. A mature leafcutter colony can strip an amount of foliage equivalent to the weight of a cow every day, and it does not eat any of it. The leaves are carried underground, sometimes for 100 meters along cleared trails, and chewed into a pulp. The pulp is fed to a fungus. The fungus grows in chambers, tended, weeded, fertilized, and kept free of infection by workers whose entire lives are given to it. The ants eat the fungus. It is agriculture. It predates human farming by something in the order of 12 million years. The colony can hold several million individuals in a nest that extends meters down through the clay and holds its own ventilation, its own waste dumps, its own antibiotic cultures grown on the bodies of the workers. There is no leadership, no plan. Every decision is made locally by an insect with a brain smaller than a grain of sand, and the result is a farm. 200 years of European effort went into crossing this isthmus, and it took 22,000 lives and a mountain of money. Underneath the same forest, something had already solved a harder problem and had been quietly running it since before there were people to notice. There is a habit, when telling the story of the canal, of treating the workers as weather, a number in a column, something the project passed through. The people themselves went somewhere. Most of them did not go home. Follow the Caribbean coast west, almost to the Costa Rican border, and you reach an archipelago of low, green islands called Bocas del Toro. Wooden houses on stilts over clear water, painted in colors that have gone soft in the salt. The language you hear on the water is English, not the English of tourists, a Caribbean Creole locally called Guari Guari, carried here from Jamaica, Barbados, and the islands of the Eastern Caribbean by people who came for work. They came first for bananas. The plantations of the Western Caribbean lowlands were built in the 1890s, and they drew labor from across the West Indies. Then the canal drew more. Then, when the digging finished, thousands stayed because there was nothing to go back to. Panama's Caribbean coast is not a footnote to the canal. It is where a large part of the canal's workforce actually lived, married, buried its dead, and raised the generation that followed. What survived is not a museum piece. It is a cuisine built on coconut milk and Scotch bonnet. It is calypso played on a Sunday afternoon. It is the reason a Panamanian schoolchild in Bocas may speak Spanish in the classroom, Creole English at home, and Ngabere with the family upriver. It took Panama a long time to look at that inheritance squarely. For decades, the West Indian community was told, in official language, to become something else. They mostly declined. Go west and inland from there, and the land climbs. Panama is often imagined flat. It is not. A mountain chain runs the length of the country, and at its western end, it rises to a volcano called Baru, 3,474 meters. On a clear morning from the summit, and there are perhaps a dozen such mornings a year, you can see the Pacific and the Caribbean at the same time. Both oceans from one point of ground, which is possible in almost nowhere else on the planet. On its eastern slope sits the town of Boquete, and around it, the reason a certain kind of person will travel a very long way to Panama. The mechanism is worth understanding because it explains an otherwise absurd price tag. Cool air from the Caribbean side comes over the divide and meets warm air rising from the Pacific slope. The result is a fine, drifting mist that locals call the bahareque. It is not rain, it hangs. It keeps the mornings grey and the afternoons cool. Coffee grown at 1,500 to 2,000 meters in that microclimate matures slowly. Slow maturation concentrates sugars and aromatic compounds in the seed. In 2004, a farm in Boquete entered an odd, jasmine-scented lot into a national competition from trees that had come out of Ethiopia decades earlier and had been more or less ignored. It broke every score in the room. That variety is called geisha. Panamanian lots of it have since sold at auction for over $30,000 per kilogram, which makes it, by a wide margin, the most expensive coffee in the world. The cherries are picked by hand, one at a time, only at full ripeness. Almost all of that picking is done by seasonal workers from the Bugle comarca, the largest indigenous territory in Panama, in mountains where the soil is thin and farming barely feeds a family. The most valuable agricultural product in the country is harvested entirely by people who come down from the poorest ground in it. Both facts are ordinary here. They sit side by side without touching. The Pacific side of Panama does something that the map does not prepare you for.
Off the coast of Veraguas,
The water is warm, shallow, sheltered by islands, and comparatively empty of food. For most large animals, that is a poor combination. For a mother humpback whale, it is exactly right. Few predators, calm water, a calf that is born without enough blubber to survive cold. So they come from the feeding grounds around Antarctica, 6,000 or 7,000 kilometers north, arriving from around July and staying into October. And then, in the opposite season, from December into April, a second group arrives. These come down from the North Pacific, different population, different ocean basin, different half of the world. Panama's Pacific coast is the only place known where humpback whales from both hemispheres come to breed. Two populations using the same nursery, 6 months apart, almost certainly never meeting. The males sing while they are here, long, structured sequences repeated for hours, changing slightly across a season until every male in the population is singing the new version. Nobody has fully explained why. The song of the southern whales and the song of the northern whales are not the same. The same bay hears two languages a year. The islands they shelter behind carry a history of their own. Coiba is the largest island in the eastern Pacific. 503 square kilometers of forest, ringed by the second largest coral reef on this side of the ocean. From 1919 until 2004, it was a penal colony. Prisoners were held in scattered camps across the island. Conditions there are remembered without affection, and for most of the 20th century, very few Panamanians would have gone near it voluntarily. Which is precisely why the forest is intact. While the mainland was cleared for cattle, Coiba was left alone because nobody wanted to be there. No logging, no development, no fishing fleet working the reef. When the prison closed, biologists found an island holding species that had disappeared from the rest of the country. Scarlet macaws, crested eagles, 147 bird species, 21 of them found nowhere else. It was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2005, a place preserved by fear. It is not a comfortable thought, and it is not rare in Panama. The same logic, on a very much larger scale, is at work in the east. Turn back toward the Darien, and the roads run out again quickly. Beyond the last of them, the country is organized by water. The Chucunaque, the longest river in Panama. The Tuira, the Sambu. They are not scenery here. They are the road network, the property boundary, the calendar, and the source of protein. Along them live the Embera and the Wunan. Two peoples, originally from the Choco, on the Colombian side of this same forest. They arrived over generations, moving upriver, and they built villages of open-sided houses raised on posts 3 meters above the ground, roofed with palm, reached by a notched log. The houses have no walls. In a climate this hot, walls are a mistake. The height keeps out the water, the snakes, and the damp. The women weave. The material is chunga palm fiber, split thin, dyed with pigments drawn from bark, fruit, and root by a process that can take weeks to produce a single color. The finest of these baskets are woven tightly enough to hold water. A small one takes around 15 days. A large one can take months. The patterns are not decorative in the way a stranger assumes. They carry the animals of the forest, the movement of the river, and marks that belong to a family. The men carve cocobolo wood and tagua nut, the seed of a palm so dense it was once shipped worldwide to be turned into buttons. And then there is jagua. The jagua fruit produces a juice that is nearly clear when it is painted on. Over the following hours, it oxidizes in the skin and turns black. The design lasts around 11 days and cannot be washed off. It is applied in geometric bands across the face, the arms, the legs. It marks occasions and status. It also, as it happens, blocks a considerable amount of ultraviolet light and discourages biting insects. Which raises a question worth sitting with. How much of what a visitor reads as ornament here is, on inspection, technology? Not all of Panama looks like this. Fly west, across the canal, to the peninsula that hangs off the country's Pacific belly, and you land somewhere that looks like southern Spain in a heat haze. Azuero. Dry hills, white churches, cattle, and a folk Catholicism older than most of the buildings in Panama City. This is where the polera comes from, a hand-embroidered dress that can take a year to make and cost more than a car, worn at carnival with gold filigree and hair ornaments called tembleques that shake when the wearer moves. It is the 10th of November, 1821. In a small town on this peninsula, La Villa de los Santos, a group of residents signs a declaration of independence from Spain and sends word to Simón Bolívar. The capital follows 3 weeks later. Panama leaves the empire without a battle and immediately joins the new Republic of Gran Colombia on the assumption that a small isthmus is safer inside something larger. Azuero paid for its own charm. It is the most deforested region in the country. Centuries of cattle and sugar stripped the dry forest that once covered it, and what remains survives in fragments on slopes too steep to clear. The peninsula that started the country is the part of it that is most nearly used up. Between those extremes, the country fills in. Colón, at the Caribbean mouth of the canal, holds the second largest duty-free zone on Earth, and some of the hardest streets in Central America, both within a few blocks of each other. El Valle de Antón sits inside the crater of an extinct volcano, one of the few inhabited calderas anywhere 6 kilometers across. The Pearl Islands lie an hour offshore, where the largest pearl in the world was taken in the 1500s and sent to a Spanish queen. Taboga smells of flowers from the water. La Amistad, on the Costa Rican border, is shared between 2 nations and covers 400,000 hectares of cloud forest that neither country has fully surveyed. And across the Bay of Panama, on the Caribbean side, there is a chain of some 365 small islands where the country's rules do not entirely apply. Guna, nearly 400 kilometers of coast and the islands off it governed by the Guna, under Guna law, by a General Congress that meets to sing. The literal meaning is Guna land. It is not a reservation. It is not a national park with people in it. The Panamanian state does not decide what happens here, and that is not an accident of remoteness. It was one. The Guna have moved before. When the Spanish arrived, they were living on the Caribbean coast of what is now Colombia. Conflict pushed them west, into the rivers of the Darien, where they found forest, and also malaria. So they moved again, out to the islands, where the sea breeze keeps the mosquitoes down. After Panama separated from Colombia in 1903, the new government decided the Guna would be modernized. Police posts were placed on the islands, Spanish schooling was imposed, traditional dress was banned, which in practice meant banning the mola, the layered applique panel a Guna woman wears and makes, and which carries her design, her skill, and her standing. Officers cut the gold rings from women's noses. In February 1925, under a leader named Nele Cantule, the Guna rose. Police posts were attacked across the islands. A number of officers were killed. The Guna declared themselves independent. A Panamanian force was assembled to put it down. What happened next was unusual. The United States, which had troops in the canal zone and interests of its own, put a warship in the water and pressed for negotiation instead. On the 4th of March 1925, an accord was signed. The Guna would remain part of Panama. In exchange, the government would respect their laws, their leadership, their language, and their customs, and would not interfere. In 1938, the territory was formally recognized. The Guna have held it since. It is worth being exact about what that means. Guna Yala is one of the few places in the Americas where an indigenous people won a legal right to refuse, to say no to a road, a hotel, a mine, a survey, and they have used it repeatedly for 100 years. Every February, on Gadi Sugdub, the revolution is performed in the streets in costume, with painted faces and wooden guns, by people who are the great-grandchildren of the men who fought it. Gadi Sugdub is 400 meters long and 150 meters wide, about the area of 5 football pitches. Until recently, around 1,300 people lived on it, in houses that had been extended outward on stilts because there was no other direction left to build. The sea around it has been rising at something over 3 millimeters a year, roughly double the rate measured in the 1960s. The island sits between half a meter and a meter above the water. The flooding came first at the highest tides, then more often. The community asked to move in 2010, not because they were forced, because they had run out of room, and because they could see what was coming, and because a people who have relocated 3 times in 500 years know how to read that. In June 2024, about 300 families crossed to the mainland, to a new settlement called Isber Yala. It is the first community in Panama formally recognized by its own government as displaced by a changing climate. The move has not been simple. The mainland site has had problems with water and power. Some elders stayed on the island. The fishing is farther away, and a people whose entire culture is built around the sea now wake up looking at a hillside. 63 more coastal communities in Panama are considered at risk. The Guna spent a century securing the right to stay where they were. Then they chose, on their own terms, in their own Congress, to leave. Those are not opposites. The first is what made the second survivable. "200 kilometers west, in the same rising water, something else is running out of room." Isla Escudo de Veraguas is a small island off the Caribbean coast, cut off from the mainland when the sea rose after the last glaciation, around 9,000 years ago. On it lives an animal found nowhere else on Earth, the pygmy 3-toed sloth. It is roughly 40% smaller than its mainland relatives. Island animals often shrink because a small body needs less food, and small islands do not offer much. It lives almost entirely in the red mangroves fringing the island, eating mangrove leaves, and it swims, which most people do not expect of a sloth. Estimates of the surviving population have run into the low hundreds. Some surveys have found fewer. 9,000 years of separate evolution on one island in a strip of mangrove a few kilometers long. The canal, too, has begun to run out of something. Every ship that crosses Panama is lifted by fresh water, and that water is not recovered. It goes down through the chambers, out through the lower gates, and into the sea. A single transit spends an enormous volume of it. And the source is Gatun Lake, which is fed only by rain, and which also supplies drinking water to more than half the country, including Panama City and Colón. The canal and the population drink from the same reservoir. In August 2023, after a strong El Niño cut rainfall across the isthmus, Gatun fell to 79.6 feet, below its working range. The authority reduced daily transits from 36 or 38 down to 24, and by February 2024, to as few as 18. Draft limits were cut, which meant ships crossing part empty. Queues built at both entrances. Some vessels waited more than 2 weeks. Some companies stopped booking and went around Africa instead. For a few months, 110 years of engineering came down to how much rain had fallen on one lake. The answer under construction is a reservoir on the Rio Indio, roughly $1.5 billion, feeding Gatun through a tunnel some 9 kilometers long. It will not deliver water before the early 2030s. Communities in the basin that would be affected have objected. The isthmus is being asked again to permit a crossing, and again, it is setting the terms. Which brings us back to a slab of cracked pavement at the edge of a town of 4,000 people. 106 kilometers, that is what is missing. There is no engineering mystery here. We have driven roads across the Andes, over permafrost, through the Alps in tunnels tens of kilometers long. Panama built a bridge across the canal in 1962 and a second one in 2004. 106 kilometers of lowland forest and swamp is not a problem that would trouble a modern Ministry of Works. The world tends to describe the Darien Gap as the place where the road could not be finished. That is the wrong sentence. It is the place where the road was not finished. 4 times over by 4 different arguments, and every one of them held. The first was disease, not human disease, foot and mouth, endemic in South American cattle and absent from the north. The Darien is the barrier that has kept it out. A road through it would be a corridor for livestock and everything livestock carry, and the cattle industries of Central and North America have never had the slightest enthusiasm for that. The second was the law. When money was finally assembled in the 1970s, a lawsuit in the United States froze it, pending a full environmental study. The study was demanded, the funding never reassembled. The third was the people who live there. More than 40,000 indigenous residents of the Darien, Embera, Wunan, and Guna opposed the road, and their objection was not sentimental. They had watched what a road does. It arrives, and behind it come settlers, chainsaws, cattle, and land titles issued to people who were not there the year before. Slash, burn, fence, repeat. They had seen it happen in Azuero. They had seen it happen along the highway as it crept east. And the fourth reason is the one nobody puts in a brochure. Panama separated from Colombia in 1903. It was able to make that separation stick, in part, because Colombia could not march an army through the Darien to reverse it. A country whose independence was underwritten by a roadless forest has never been in a hurry to build a road through it. What is on the other side of that pavement is not empty. Darien National Park covers 5,750 square kilometers, a World Heritage Site since 1981. It holds the largest block of lowland rainforest on the Pacific side of Central America. 4 species of macaw, jaguar, Baird's tapir, giant anteater, and the greatest concentration of harpy eagles left in this half of the world. The bird that cannot live in a forest with a road through it lives here because there is no road. People do cross. They have for years on foot, along river courses and mule tracks, in groups over the better part of a week or more, carrying what they can. The forest does not distinguish between them and the Scots. There are rivers that rise without warning, and there is no help. Whatever anyone thinks about why they walk, the walking itself is one of the harder things a person can attempt on this continent, and many do not finish it. Something else happened in 1698 that is worth saying plainly now. The Scots did not lose to an enemy. They chose a bay, unloaded, and were beaten by rainfall, drainage, soil chemistry, and an insect. Every subsequent attempt on this ground has met the same committee. The one recorded vehicle crossing of any note took an expedition in 1960, around 136 days. 4.5 months, winching, rafting, cutting, to cover a distance you could cycle in 2 days on tarmac. And the road is moving again. A $70 million extension with 2 new bridges has now carried the pavement to the edge of the national park. Not through it, to it. Everything that has been preserved out there has been preserved by a decision that has to be made again every generation, by people who will not personally benefit from making it. There is a particular kind of silence at the end of a road. Not the silence of nowhere. Yaviza is loud. Boats, radios, a market, children on the bridge over the Chukunake. It is the silence of a sentence that stops mid-word. 30,000 kilometers of asphalt from the Arctic Ocean, and then a curb, and then trees. In a lowland forest not far from there, in a country that has spent 5 centuries being crossed, there is a small, yellow frog. The Panamanian golden frog. It is not a frog that hides. It sits on rocks beside fast streams, bright as a warning label, which is exactly what it is. Its skin carries a toxin potent enough that predators learn the color and never test it twice. Because the streams are loud, it developed something almost no other amphibian uses. It waves. A slow lift and rotation of one forelimb held up to signal to another frog across water it cannot shout over. Then, a fungal disease moved through the highlands of Central America and took the amphibians of these forests with it. The golden frog has not been reliably recorded in the wild since around 2009. It survives in captivity. Colonies in Panama and abroad breed it, treat it, and hold it. Returning it is another matter because the fungus has not left. Panama put the frog on its lottery tickets. There is a national day for it, the 14th of August. A country that has never reliably protected its forests made a public holiday out of an animal that its forests can no longer support. That is not hypocrisy. It is a kind of grief, formalized. 3 million years ago, this narrow country rose out of the sea and joined 2 worlds that had never met. Everything alive walked across it. Bears going south, sloths going north. It is the largest overland exchange in the history of the Americas, and it happened on this ground. The land was built as a bridge. And the one animal it has never let finish crossing is us. We have gone over it in mule trains. We have gone through it in ships, lifted 26 meters into the air by rainwater. We have flown above it in 90 minutes. The one thing we have not done in 500 years of trying is drive. The road stops at Yaviza because a series of people decided that it should, for reasons of cattle disease and courtrooms and sovereignty and the objections of 40,000 residents. None of those reasons is permanent. Every one of them could be argued again next year. The forest on the other side does not know that it is being protected by an argument. Perhaps what matters is not whether the last 106 kilometers are ever built. It is that for 300 years, on a continent that has connected almost everything to almost everything else, one piece of ground has been allowed to remain unanswered, and that somewhere, every few decades, a room full of people has quietly decided to leave it that way. Whether the next room does the same, nobody can tell you. If you would like to keep traveling with us, subscribe, and we will take you somewhere else that most maps get wrong. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.